Everything starts with a drawing, a pencil sketch. I sketch all over the place, on walls, in a little book that I always carry with me. I've got hundreds of these little sketchbooks, and it's really like a way of automatic thinking. Sometimes I'll work those up into more complete pencil drawings on paper. Most of them are actually the size of a tray in an aeroplane, because I used to do a lot of drawing actually as I was flying on aeroplanes. That's really where it all starts. You go from the idea into notating down on paper that first idea. And it's like a great privilege, the ability to translate a thought into something physical. And that's really, really the start, which is actually a very fragile physicality, because you're going from an idea into a bit of graphite on paper. And over the years, I've really developed my drawing into an art form of its own. So I definitely consider drawings to be complete and substantial works on their own, but they do generally relate to paintings or sculpture or installation works as well. Sometimes what I'll do is actually take a photograph of a physical location and actually draw and paint on it. So I'll paint the sculpture, the idea of the sculpture, onto a photograph. It's kind of a virtual reality in a sense, because the sculpture is coming to life on that photo that I've taken. And actually, increasingly with time, I've become more interested in photography as a medium, but not on its own. I like to incorporate other elements into it, which is really the merging of, if you like, the imaginative with the real, which is what my work is all about, moving from imagination into reality. The first steps are drawing and then these painted photographs. From there, I'll generally move into wax or clay and do a little maquette in wax or clay, which sometimes needs to be propped up with other elements such as string or wood to see how it will be installed in the real world. Or those elements might also be additions to the actual sculpture, or actually incorporated into the sculpture, as when I created Flight for the first time, which is a flying man in the air. Once I've made the maquette, I then move on to the foundry, where I'll make a large-scale sculpture, usually in plaster and with other elements, and that's then cast into bronze, which is actually a very, very physical and laborious process involving the foundry, involving molten metal. And once that piece is completed, which is really the real physical labour part of it, moving from that idea to that maquette and then into the large piece. And I always engage very closely with the large piece. It's never merely an enlargement. I'll always work on every square inch of these sculptures, because I believe very much that the texture and the life of the surface of the bronze is really very, very important. And then, of course, I've got a great team who will install the works, and that in itself, in a kind of Monty Python sort of way, is a kind of work of art in itself, when you see the sculpture lying in different poses or taking off into the sky or moving around on a truck. I also take photos or films of the sculpture when it's in those different positions and en route. And those things themselves, I often think the still photographs of these can be quite interesting, because that's all part of the process, all part of the life of the sculpture. And then you also have to think of the location where they're going. So in the case of Flight, it's gone to St Pancras New Church, which is just on the Euston Road opposite Euston Station. And it's a kind of garden, but it's right on the Euston Road, and one of the most populated parts of London. I mean, you have thousands and thousands of people going past every hour right past that spot, and it's very near to King's Cross as well, and the trains Eurostar to Europe. So it becomes quite interesting when you move from a very, very internal thing, a drawing or an idea, and then it becomes public out there in the real world, and the whole process that entails of moving from concept to maquette to bronze to installation and then to reality. And I love this idea of the piece moving around and then becoming part of the real world from the conceptual world. And often you find that there changes take place that you hadn't really thought about, because of course you're far below a piece that at one point you'd held directly in your hands. It was very, very tangible. And then especially in the case of Flight, it's literally flying in the sky. The other thing is, once it's there, you can take it further. And that's where the landscape around the sculpture comes into play, but also, crucially, the lighting at night. And with Flight, I was particularly interested in how that would light against the wall of that neoclassical building, the shadows that would be cast by the lights at night onto that fantastic wall, which itself is just a great slab of stone, which very much offsets the bronze and is sort of in contrast to the bronze. When working on a small maquette, I'm very interested in the impact of my thumbprints on the clay. It's a very, very direct way of working. And when I move from this smaller piece to the large-scale version that's intended, I very much try to keep that sense of the artist's hand, the imprint, onto the clay and then onto the bronze. Because I feel, in a way, sculpture, I've always said, is more like painting than painting itself. Because you're using that material from the earth, clay, in order to replicate a breathing life form and a sense of the power of humanity just there in front of you. During a recent visit to Paris, I was walking around and sculptures kind of come to mind. They're almost like, it's again, automatic thinking. And I'll see a space, in this case the Tuileries Gardens, and think of a sculpture, kind of dream up a sculpture, maybe suggested by shadows or just a thought. And then I'll take the photo of that spot and work up the photo with a painting on the photograph or a drawing on the photograph. And then, after I've done that, I'll make a small maquette, often in wax, which can then be cast directly in bronze. I've called some works Miracle. There's two versions of Miracle. They're actually figures that are intended to work on water. So you'll see here the mirror image of this figure in the water. And I call it Miracle because it's not sinking into the water. He's floating on the water, effectively, looking at his own reflection. So that version of Miracle is looking at himself kind of introspectively within the water. So the water becomes metaphorical. And then I've also played a lot with images of eggs. So I have a maquette in bronze of eggs sort of hatching, sort of growing and hatching. And then I moved from bronze to polystyrene. And then from polystyrene, I realized that I could draw on the polystyrene and then move into steel by cutting out what's a line on the polystyrene becomes basically a form within steel itself. So you can work around different media, from drawing to painting to bronze to steel. And I feel that all these, it's really what's behind all of these is the idea, the concept of something that's riveting and has some kind of meaning. So I love this process of working up the photograph into the sculpture. It's quite an exciting thing, that transformation that happens, and then going straight into the sculptural form afterwards. And with my studio and with my great colleague Greg Baker, we actually create photoshopped images where I'll take the maquette, the small maquette, and actually it's inserted into the photograph, becomes a kind of virtually real situation, so you can actually see how the sculpture will be, and then I'll move it into the monumental piece. We're doing an exhibition at the moment of monumental works on my website, where you can see a number of these monumental works, both existing ones and ones that are in the process of being made, from the maquette towards the conceived and finalized work.